Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I do have a few numbers, but I mainly have a lot of pictures, which hopefully will aid the digestive process. Now, I was being interviewed earlier this year, and one of the questions I got asked is, could I pick one word that summarised pretty much everything that had gone on over the last 12 months? Initially, I thought, what a stupid question. How can you possibly distill everything, all those moving parts, down into one word? Then it occurred to me there was actually one word that did a pretty good job of picking it all up, I think, and that word is uncertainty. We certainly climbed a wall of worry as we moved through 2019. Uncertainty was an all-pervasive theme. It's had an impact on economies, it's had an impact on financial markets, and I think it's going to be a pretty good word to be using as we move through 2020 as well. So what's driving that uncertainty? Well, there have really been many concerns. Some have proved persistent, some have been short-lived, and I've just picked a selection of those on this particular chart here. It shows you what we searched for on Google during 2019. That includes obvious topics like trade wars and Brexit and so on, and there were some more kind of exotic themes that financial markets get excited about, like negative yields and inverted yield curves and so on. But in the end, it all really comes down to concern about uncertainty. What are these things going to do? What do they mean for the economic outlook? And why is it important? Well, the problem is that uncertain times, what typically happens is that businesses put off their capital spending plans. Households decide, well, that new car I was going to buy, maybe I'll just wait a little bit longer before doing that, because I'm not quite sure how things are going to play out. And that very quickly can start to have a real big economic impact. And you can get a flavour for that on the chart on the left-hand side here. The red line, believe it or not, is actually a measure of uncertainty for the global economy. The way it works is that red line goes down. It means we're becoming more uncertain about the outlook. As you can see, as that uncertainty lifted last year, well, what we did see a pullback in consumer spending on durables, the blue line on that particular chart. And of course, on the business front, we saw companies cut their spending on things like machinery and equipment. This was a global theme that we saw coming through. And what do you discover? Most of these consumer durables, these investment goods, have to be made. So industrial production, when you move to the chart on the right-hand side, dropped dramatically. Most global trade is consumer durables and business investment goods. And so the green line on that particular chart, global trade, moved in the same direction. And while the numbers might suggest we didn't actually get that recession everybody worried about last year, we obviously came pretty close when you look at numbers like this and the trends that we're seeing there. Now, the other part of the uncertainty story we also need to think about is that uncertainty certainly depresses investment spending, but it also increases savings. We all want to put a bit of money away against that kind of backdrop. And you can see it happening globally in this particular chart here. So the pink line, investment, you can see the way that's dropped away, running at quite low levels in this uncertain environment. And the green line, global savings, the way that is actually picked up. We're actually at the point where global savings is running ahead of global investment. It's supply and demand, like it is in every market. If there's an excess supply of money, the price has to adjust. That price is interest rates. This chart explains why interest rates are low everywhere. And as long as this uncertainty persists, and it looks like it will, then we have to expect very low interest rates to be a long-running theme in the landscape as well. And that brings with it new risks, new uncertainties to think about as well. So what do we do when interest rates are low? Well, in financial markets, where we typically go out and look out where can we find a better rate of return, a higher yield, where can we find some capital gain? And while we're pursuing those two things, well, we're taking on more risk. The additional part of the story this time around, I think, is that households are moving in the same direction. That money you're earning on your term deposits just not enough these days. We're kind of being forced or encouraging parts of the household sector to take on a lot more risk to generate income. So there's a whole new range of issues to be concerned about there. The bottom line really is, I think, beware the extremes and be prepared for volatility in financial markets, whatever may happen in the real economy. Now, certainly by the end of last year, some of that uncertainty had receded. We had a trade deal. Brexit actually happened. We survived. But of course, nature abhors a vacuum, and so plenty of new uncertainties have emerged since then. And in short order, we've been buffeted by a series of near-biblical events, I think, with bushfires, viruses, smoke, and of course floods in the mix there as well. So uncertainty is on the rise again. We're seeing the usual competition as well between economists to see who can come up with the most negative scenario based on all of these new developments. So I'm going to add in my particular views there as well. Well, firstly on the bushfires, well, we can actually map those areas that have been tragically affected by the bushfires onto economic data, and that's what I've attempted to do on this chart. So it shows you the main regions around Australia where these bushfires were located, and it gives you a bit of a snapshot of the structure of those areas. So in total, those regions that I picked here account for about 3.5% of Australian GDP. They account for about 3.8% of total jobs in Australia. So, I mean, the rough rule of thumb here is on those sort of numbers that basically every 10% drop in activity is going to knock about 0.3 percentage points off overall Australian GDP growth. Now that's quite a significant number. It will be spread out over a period of time, which will kind of minimise the kind of the big shock aspect of the story. And of course, what tends to get ignored in the debate is the usual forecasting rule here, and that is whatever you lose on the way down, you tend to get back during the rebuilding effort. When we dig a little bit deeper as well, there's certain aspects of the structure of these regions that I think will also help minimise the damage to the broader economy. I'll get an idea of the structure on this chart here, which just shows you the composition of employment in those regions. If you run your eye down that list, what you discover is around about 1/3 of employment in those areas is what you call kind of public sector related areas. I would say these people's jobs are pretty safe, their incomes are safe. In fact, they're probably going to be busier than ever given that rebuild effort. In the same vein, around about 10% of the workforce in those areas is involved in construction. Well, they're clearly going to be very busy during the rebuild effort. What concerns me and where I think the real risk lies in this story is the components that relate to, I guess, what you could kind of group together as tourism aspects of the story. And around about 20% of those economies are involved in tourism based on the numbers you see here. Of course, it's in that tourism consumer type of space where we start to overlap with the new concerns about the coronavirus and what that might mean for our economies. We do now have an official name for it. Overnight, the World Health Organisation has decided they're going to call it COVID-19. They've also described it as public enemy number one, which frankly sounds a much better title for it when it comes down to it. Now, of course, these kind of geomedical events, they go hand in hand with the geopolitical events that we've spent a lot of time worrying about. The way they work, or the way they impact negatively on economies is through the increase in uncertainty that they bring with them once again. And we do have some benchmarks here. We can look at the SARS virus and what happened there back in 2003, and Australia actually escaped relatively unscathed at the time. The big concern now, of course, is that China's a much bigger part of the global economy. They were 4% of GDP, global GDP back in 2003. They're 18% now. So the potential downside is obviously much bigger just because of that increase in size. What concerns me, though, again, is really more the uncertainty aspects of this story. The World Health Organisation, along with talking about the virus, also now talks about what they call an infodemic. And that is, there is so much information out there, a lot of it wrong, a lot of it contradictory, that the concern is, of course, that we're just going to add to the overall fear and uncertainty that we're seeing. One of the things we're tracking to try and monitor that, kind of a near real-term indicator, if you like, is what you can see on the chart on the left-hand side here. So it just shows you, once again, Google searches for various epidemics that we've seen over the years, and I think watching the red line on that chart, the coronavirus this time around, that will be the one to track, get a feel for just how this sentiment and uncertainty story is playing out right now. And certainly the risk is with social media, a much bigger thing than it was back in 2003, that we can amplify the negatives of this uncertainty. I don't want to suggest technology is necessarily a bad thing here, and I was particularly impressed by one of the passengers on that cruise ship trapped off Japan at the moment who organised for a drone to deliver a case of wine to him. So there are solutions there. When we bring it back to an Australian context, well, the sectors that look to be most at risk here are education and tourism. I'm just going to focus on tourism, given the kind of ties nicely with the bushfire part of the story as well. And of course, the focus is very much on the drop in foreign tourists coming to Australia. We've certainly seen this happen before. When there are shocks, economic, medical, whatever, foreign tourists decide to stay at home. And the chart on the left-hand side here just shows you what happens with tourist arrivals, foreign tourists coming to Australia around those different events. And the red line, the SARS one, was pretty clear there that the number of people coming to Australia dropped off pretty quickly. The trouble you find with the debate right now, that's where the analysis stops. Reality is there are far more Australians who go overseas to have a holiday than foreigners who come to Australia for a holiday. And Australian tourists are just as susceptible to these shocks. And the chart on the right-hand side there shows you what happens with the Australian appetite to go on an overseas holiday around similar sorts of events, and the result is actually the same. We stop going. But if we're not going on an overseas holiday, it doesn't mean to say we're just going to sit at home. Quite likely the outcome will be that we'll go on a domestic holiday. And when you crunch the numbers here, it's quite possible that kind of shift by Australians from overseas to domestic holidays will more than offset the impact of foreign tourists coming here. Now, that's just a scenario, and I'm sure there will be some sort of negative effect, but these are the sort of issues you need to think about when we're trying to assess the risks here. Now, this tourism story, it does largely play out in the consumer space, and that's important because the real domestic risk in the Australian economy for some time now has been the constrained consumers. Australian consumers, for a whole range of reasons, have limited their consumer spending. It is the biggest part of the economy overall. And the chart here, the brown line, it just shows you growth in consumer spending. You can see the big slowdown at the end of the chart there. We're seeing the sort of growth rates that we last saw at the height of the global financial crisis. It's being intensified at the moment, of course, because there's a big downturn in residential construction underway at the same time. And that's magnifying the impact of the household story. And this chart is, of course, the reason why the Reserve Bank has been cutting interest rates and why we've been seeing tax cuts, tax rebates and so on being paid as well. It's all designed to try and help this particular part of the domestic economic story. So how is this playing out? Well, we can actually see the impact, I think, on some interesting parts of the story here and some new indicators that the Commonwealth Bank constructs. We've known for a long time that our business information is a very up-to-date read on what is happening in the Australian economy. And to that, we've added the idea that before anybody spends any money at all these days, the first thing you do is jump onto the internet and search around for product reviews and who's got the best price and the like. So what we've actually done is combine our transactions activity data with Google search activity to come up with a range of measures on household spending intentions. And you can see a selection of them on this set of charts here. So on the left-hand side, the blue line, it's kind of an overall measure for consumer spending intentions. Now, it's picked up a little bit towards the end of that chart when you look at it, but I'd have to say it's a pretty limp response given the size of the interest rate cuts we've seen, and of course the size of the tax rebates that have been paid as well. I think some indications here that economic policy is not working very well in Australia right now. Where it is clearly working though is you go to the middle panel where the chart there, the pink line shows you home buying intentions. Well, that's rocketed up and in fact is running at about the highest level that we've seen in the life of the data that we have here. It's a pretty good leading indicator of where house prices are going and it certainly suggests there's more upside in that part of the story. It does raise the possibility that we're going to get some help for consumer spending in things like a positive wealth effect coming through. The final chart shows you spending intentions for things like travel and education. And it's early days, but if you look at the end of that chart, it does look like those spending intentions are starting to be wound back. It does look like we are seeing some impact from the bushfires and from the coronavirus and the like. So there are certainly some early warning signs there that we'll be watching pretty closely. What can we do? Well, the way economists tend to answer that question is that we resort to the three Ps. They are population, productivity and participation. These are the things in the end that just determine how fast economies can grow, how much income those economies generate and the like. And when you look at this chart that shows you what's happening there, well, we're actually got quite strong population growth. That's helping. We've seen labour force participation rise to a record high. The missing link here is really productivity. Productivity performance has been pretty dismal in recent years. It is impacting on our potential growth rate. It's very important because unless we have rising productivity, we're not going to get rising real wages, which is what we need to fix that consumer part of the story. It's what we need to deal with an ageing population, and we heard some of those issues discussed earlier on. Well, what can we do in terms of the specifics? Well, economists love infrastructure, so we'd love to see some more spending there, including in terms of human capital as well as the physical side that gets a lot of attention. But there's so much happening at the moment, it's difficult to ramp it up any further, I think. But one area that's worth looking is what's happening on the small scale, local government infrastructure. This shows the results of a report, and what it's basically saying is that around about $20 billion worth of, in fact $30 billion worth of local government infrastructure is in poor condition. We can actually devote some money to these small projects. It'll have a big economic effect. It will help productivity. And of course, a lot of this work needs to be done in rural and regional areas that could clearly benefit from some assistance right now. A lot of the policy debate you'll hear at the moment is all about unconventional monetary policy. Well, we think conventional fiscal policy is probably a better way to promote this cause. The government has a very good balance sheet. They should use that balance sheet to do the sort of things we need, just not for the short term, but for the longer haul as well. And just finally, the other point I'd want to make is the last chart here on the right-hand side. Government has a fantastic balance sheet, but so does the business sector. And we're going to ask the government to use its balance sheet to help the economy. Then clearly business has a role here to play as well. And there's certainly plenty of opportunities for business in this uncertain environment. One thing I am certain of is that I've run out of time. So on that point, I will stop. You may like to just quickly enjoy our ever-lengthening disclaimer. Thank you.